This is the story of the most cynical political game in American history.
The Democratic Party somehow has convinced black people that they're the good guys. Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, is perceived to be the bad guys. Never mind the skanky history of the Democratic Party. That was a party of slavery.
This is the story of how the Democrats won America's black vote.
He said, listen, I gotta give these niggas enough. Not too much, but enough that I'll have them voting Democrat for the next 200 years.
It's the story of how the specter of racism became a political weapon.
The primary basis of the Democratic Party's appeal to black voters is the invocation of racism.
If I tell you this is racist, if I tell you that is racist, yeah, I'm gonna get you emotional, I'm gonna get you to jump, I'm gonna get you to skip.
Of how the politics of race are used to smear America's working class.
The basket of deplorables, untouchable racists, bigots, and the term simmering under the surface when you hear these comments is white trash.
Of how the Democrats, once the party of segregation, came to rely once more on racial division.
It's impossible to envision a world without race for the Democratic Party. It's impossible to envision a world that gets beyond race because their bread and butter and their bottom line, their raison d'etre, and everything that they're trying to do depends upon people being kept in these boxes.
The things that you guys are doing.
It's about the Americans hitting back.
Oh, but we black. You gonna tell me how to be black, right? You're a fraud. Look at you. These are frauds. And now y'all got the audacity to say Black Lives Matter. Y'all don't care about black people.
I don't find it satisfying to think of myself as a black person. I'm a father and a husband and a bunch of other remarkable things. And all of those things are far more important to me than being black.
That's true. Wait a minute. That's true.
Yeah! Bevelyn Beatty has received a legal letter following her recent arrest by the New York police.
We gotta make sure that's the summons! Yo! You know what?
They are dropping charges against her.
The NYPD has failed to file a legally acceptable accusatory instrument with this court. There is no need for you to return to court on the summons number referenced above. That is crazy. Yeah, that is crazy.
Bevelyn has been arrested several times at events organized by Black Lives Matter. But she is not campaigning for Black Lives Matter. Bevelyn is campaigning against them. Protesters have painted Black Lives Matter in big yellow letters outside Trump Tower in New York. They say Donald Trump is racist. And they're calling for the police to be defunded because they say they too are racist.
Okay, so Martin, we're going to paint the Black Lives Matter mural on 5th Avenue black.
You guys, we're here. Just stay tuned. Black Lives Matter, right?
Bevelyn insists that the largely white, left-wing supporters of Black Lives Matter have little connection with or understanding of ordinary black people.
They say Black Lives Matter. They say Black Lives Matter, right? Oh, they don't care about black lives. They don't care about...
She says that the left's theatrical crusade against racism is nothing but a charade, a front for promoting otherwise unpopular left-wing politics.
They don't care about that. They can kill that demon. They can kill that. Black Lives Matter is a demon. It's the devil.
As for the campaign to defund the police, Bevelyn grew up in a poor black neighborhood. She has been shot, she has been stabbed, and she and her friends, far from wanting fewer police, would rather like more.
They don't care. Sis, I grew up in the hood. I need my police. I need them to come. My brothers is from Camden. But when you grew up in the burb, you ain't seeing and police just cruise by to make sure everything's okay, you kind of tend to think, what's the point of the police? But when you seeing shootings every day, and it's your own family members either shooting at each other or getting shot at, it's like, wait a minute. Everybody knows in the hood, if the police come, that's when you come out. When they leave, you leave. Y'all want the black cop to die? Huh? Do Black Lives Matter when it's a black cop?
According to many left-wing activists, black people live in fear of white cops, and indeed white people in general, all of whom are racist, whether or not they realize it or admit it. But Bevelyn Beatty recalls her pleasant surprise when she moved into a white neighborhood in Maine.
When I got to Maine, it's like, oh my God, the whitest state in the world. It's just so white. But I'm gonna tell you something right now about Maine. Living in a predominantly white state, I felt more safe than living in a predominantly black state. And I'm being honest. I'm just keeping it 100. You know, when you live in predominantly black communities, don't pull up in a nice car. 9 times out of 10, when you leave, they're clocking you when you leave, and they gonna hit your crib, okay? You move into the white neighborhoods, you get your packages, you call your neighbor. I remember one time I thought I left my oven on. I called my neighbor, I said, hey, Carly, could you go check and see if my oven's on? Oh, sure, absolutely. I'll be over there right now. She went over there so quick, made sure my oven was good, locked my door. If you're just saying, lock your door, I'll lock it for you. Listen, I'm gonna be honest with you. You're not gonna really get this in a lot of black communities. I'm not saying all, but I'm just saying.
And that's, people are gonna listen to what you're saying right now and take offense, but it is a fact.
This is President Ronald Reagan and myself.
Robert Woodson is a veteran civil rights campaigner.
This is myself with President Ford and Jimmy Carter.
He has spent his life working directly with black people in America's poorest inner-city areas to improve their lives, and he has been recognized repeatedly for his work.
I was given the Presidential Award, and it was given in the Oval Office, and this was my granddaughter who had to write an essay, and she wrote about the president's dog. That's what impressed her most.
Since the start of the 1960s, he has witnessed the collapse of the black family, the rise of black crime, the descent of poor black neighborhoods into lawless ghettos. But he refuses to accept that racism is the cause. And to prove it, he points to the history of black people in America.
The black-on-black crime, high incarceration rates, 70% out-of-wedlock births. A lot of naysayers try to suggest that that was attributed to the legacy of slavery and discrimination. That is just untrue. It's patently untrue.
Long after the end of slavery, black people in America continued to face the most terrible racism. They were demonized, abused by employers, turned away from restaurants and hotels, excluded from schools and colleges, and denied justice. They were terrorized by organized gangs of hooded racist thugs who were themselves protected by racist cops, judges, and politicians. And yet, despite all this, in the decades that followed abolition, black people used what freedom they had to transform their lives for the better.
There were large numbers of blacks who were skilled craftsmen. They were iron workers. They could work with leather. They were carpenters. And so these workers were in demand. And wage rates, as a consequence, soared.
Black people worked hard and saved. They bought their own homes, built their own churches and schools. When racist shop owners refused to serve them, they set up their own. When racist employers refused to hire them, they went into business themselves. By 1910, even in the former slave state of North Carolina, a quarter of urban black households owned their own home. A third of rural black families owned their own farm. Around 28% of businesses in the state were owned by blacks, including theaters, drugstores, and realtor firms.
All the stores in the community were owned by blacks. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. It was the St. Charles in Chicago, the St. Teresa in New York, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, I can go on and on and on. A little-known fact, there were 20 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires.
Black people built their own colleges. By 1920, across America, there were more than 100 colleges of higher education for black people, and no fewer than 15 black universities.
There was a thirst for education, and blacks flocked to these schools.
Here at Howard University, located in Washington, D.C., this meteorology class teaches future flyers celestial navigation. Howard University Medical School has one of the country's leading authorities on blood plasma.
Far from it being impossible to get into higher education, by the 1930s, these 15 black universities were having to compete for black students, advertising the achievements of their alumni.
The late George Washington Carver, honored in the chemistry of agriculture, law, elected judge of New York City Court, medicine, leading New York City surgeon, education, principal of a New York City public school, curator, Schomburg Collection of Literature, international prize-winning sculptor, explorer, financier and publisher, men and women in every walk of life.
By the 1940s, black businesses had grown considerably in number and scale.
I can give endless examples of the kind of businesses they built.
The late C.C. Spaulding pioneered as founder of the North Carolina Mutual, the largest of Negro America's 58 insurance companies. The Pittsburgh Courier, largest Negro newspaper in America with a 300,000 circulation. Owner-publisher Mrs. Robert Vann and editor-in-chief Bill Nunn oversee 16 different weekly editions. The thousands of independent businesses in every part of the country, serving every imaginable want and need of the consumer, are the final gauge of prosperity and progress.
Not every black person went to university or set up a business or even owned their own home. But even in poorer black communities, there was self-reliance and ambition. Walter Williams would go on to become one of America's most distinguished economists, but he started life in just such a neighborhood.
I grew up in a very poor neighborhood in Philadelphia, and blacks were proud people. Even poor people worked. My stepfather used to say to me that any kind of a job is better than begging and stealing. He would say, look, if you want to be successful in this world, you got to come early and stay late. That was the kind of philosophy that we got, and we were poor.
In black neighborhoods across America, church played a central part in communal life. Marriage rates were high, divorce rates low, and it was rare for a baby to be born out of wedlock.
Between 1920 and 1940, Black America had the highest marriage rate of any other group in the country. 85% up until 1960 of black families had a man and a woman raising children.
In 1938 to 1942, the black illegitimacy rate, or out of wedlock birth rate if you prefer, was 10 to 11%.
Back in the day, black people were Christian. Especially black Americans, we were strong Christians. Everybody in the neighborhood you knew, they basically family. If a neighbor didn't have food, they knew they could come to their neighbor, say, hey, listen, they'll send something over to feed the family. There was a dependency on the community. There was a true understanding of neighboring one another. Grandma was the pillar in the community. Fathers were fathers to the fatherless in the community.
Elderly people could walk without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren.
In the first half of the 20th century, black crime rates were far, far lower than they are today. In the 1920s, despite the racist judges, juries, and cops, 8 out of 10 convicts in America's prisons were white. By the mid-20th century, black people had achieved truly astonishing progress since the dark days of slavery, building communities that were self-reliant, proud, ambitious, and decent.
That's the reality of Black America prior to the 1960s. That's the Black America that does not get much recognition.
And all of this in the face of the most pervasive, ugly racism.
A lot of racism, man, a whole lot of it. And yet people built homes and families, they started businesses, they strove to do as well as they could under the circumstances. And moreover, they created the foundation for a movement that overturned the racism.
Racism and the history of discrimination in America is not responsible for the conditions that we're witnessing today.
But if not racism, then what? How did the self-reliant, law-abiding black neighborhoods of the first half of the 20th century turn into the terrifying, lawless black ghettos of today?
Keep your hands where I can see them. Come on up.
To understand, it is necessary to delve into the history of race in America and retell perhaps the most extraordinary story in American political history. The transformation of the Democratic Party from the party of slavery and segregation into the party that claims to best represent Black America. The early racist Hollywood epic, Birth of a Nation, depicts the American South on the eve of civil war. This was a time when Democrats had a near monopoly of power in the southern states. The Southern Democrats defended slavery and later Jim Crow and segregation. In their election posters, the Democrats declared themselves to be the party of the white man. The Republicans were derided as a party for black people. The Democrats represented white supremacy. The Republicans were the devils attempting to end slavery. In Birth of a Nation, the Northern Republican Yankees who invaded the South are reviled for fighting alongside black troops. The good guys are the hooded Ku Klux Klan.
Most black people are completely unaware that Democrats started the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is the organization that in the 20s had almost 4 or 5 million people. It was started by Democrats, and it used to be called the terror wing of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party voted against the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th Amendment freed the slave. The 14th Amendment gave newly freed slaves citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, at least on paper, gave slaves the right to vote. Democrats voted against all three of those things.
By 1930, 21 black people had been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Every single one of them was a Republican.
The first Republican Party in Texas was started by black people. Not the Black Republican Party, the Republican Party, started by black people.
By the 1970s, only 3 black people had been elected to the Senate, but all of them were Republican. It was the Republican President Eisenhower who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 in an effort to force Southern Democrats to respect the voting rights of black people.
I propose to end segregation in the District of Columbia, including the federal government, and any segregation in the armed forces.
It was the Republican Eisenhower who sent in troops to enforce desegregation in the Democrat-dominated South.
On September 27, 1957, President Eisenhower sent 1,000 men of the United States Army to carry out the law. The Supreme Court of the United States had said, "The entire strength of the nation may be used to enforce, in any part of the land, the security of all rights entrusted by the Constitution." And that included my rights and the rights of 8 other Negro Americans who wanted to go to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The Democratic Party somehow has convinced black people that they're the good guys. Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, is perceived to be the bad guys. Never mind the skanky history of the Democratic Party. That was a party of slavery.
But by the end of the 1950s, the racism of the Southern Democrats was catching up with them. America's black population, which lived mainly in the South, had grown in prosperity and confidence. They were no longer willing to put up with the local Jim Crow laws designed to stop them voting. And when they won the vote, as they soon inevitably would, they weren't likely to vote Democrat. The leading Democrat, Lyndon B. Johnson, was a known bigot. He had even voted against an anti-lynching bill. But now he was worried. These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days. And that's a problem for us, since they've got something now they've never had before: political pull. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. LBJ's plan for winning black votes was ingenious.
This administration today declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
Johnson launched his war on poverty with a massive program of public spending, much of it directed specifically at America's black communities.
He implemented a war on poverty, a program to help you guys. You've been through so much. You've been through so much struggle, even though his party is, the blood is on his party's hands.
The Democrats expanded welfare and sent legions of government officials into black neighborhoods in particular, going from door to door, offering welfare assistance.
What these government workers did was go out among poor blacks and working class blacks and actually recruit them into the welfare system. You have a right to welfare. After all, whites have taken from us over the years during slavery. Therefore, we have a right to reparations, and welfare is a form of reparations, payment for past misdeeds on the part of whites.
Welfare stepped into the picture and said, I can get you an apartment. I can get you some money at the beginning of the month. You don't have to worry or struggle about taking care of your kids. It sounded beautiful, and people fell for it.
As a consequence, we saw millions of blacks flooding into the welfare system over the course of about 4 years.
Johnson was convinced he could buy the black vote. He even boasted, I'll have them niggers voting Democratic for 200 years.
He was smart. He said, listen, I gotta give them these niggas enough. Not too much, but enough that I'll have them voting Democrat for the next 200 years.
As LBJ predicted, his massive welfare spending spree won the Democrats' black electoral support. But as ever more black people came to rely on welfare, commentators noticed a subtle alteration in the character of black neighborhoods.
When you tell people that they have the right to live at the expense of other people, that is, live through the government welfare programs, then you're going to expect a change in their behavior.
In the decades after slavery, black people set up dozens of their own banks and savings and loan companies. Black people not only worked hard, but prudently saved their money to guard against possible troubles ahead. But with the advent of welfare support, there was no longer the same need to save against a rainy day, nor was there the same urgency to find and keep a job.
When you consider health care, housing aid, food stamps, when you add up all of the array of services that are offered to welfare recipients, it made it much more profitable for families to go on welfare than to work.
But there was another change brought about by welfare that would have a truly devastating effect on the black community. And that was in people's attitude to marriage and having a baby. Until the expansion of the welfare state, in black communities, it was considered deeply shocking to have a baby out of wedlock.
You just couldn't do that. You couldn't because it was shameful. You couldn't afford it, number one. If people wasn't gonna just step in, there wasn't a government to step in and just pay for your mistakes. If you had that baby, you were gonna take care of that baby. Fathers would go to these men and with a shotgun, like, listen, you're gonna do right by my daughter and you're gonna take care of your baby because it costs money.
The two families would get together and they would have what's called a shotgun wedding. They would force the boy to marry the girl. Now, you may look at that and say that's a bad thing, but the point is, getting somebody pregnant in those days was not only a moral crisis, it was an economic crisis. Who's going to pay for it?
But with the offer of welfare assistance, the economic logic of teen pregnancy was turned on its head.
A girl who gets pregnant will get food stamps, will get AFDC, will get transportation vouchers, what's called women, infant, and children medical health care. You add it all up, and a woman with 2 children makes more money than she would if she worked a minimum wage job in every single state in this union.
What the welfare state says, look, we will give you housing, we will give you food stamps, we'll give you a stipend. All you have to do is have a baby.
As welfare worked its magic in America's poorer black neighborhoods, the number of children born to single mothers shot upwards at an incredible rate. As early as the 1970s, the economist Thomas Sowell was sounding the alarm.
You make the following statement: the current large and rising numbers of female-headed families among blacks is a modern phenomenon stemming from the era of the welfare state.
Yes. It was rare, particularly for teenage black women, to have children with no man in the house. One period, 3% of the black families were headed by teenage girls.
And that figure is now over 50%.
I don't know what the teenage girl percentage is, but it's an awful lot.
Right, yeah,
it's an awful lot higher than that.
By the 1980s, there were scenes that would have astonished previous generations. Schools established large creches to accommodate the dozens of children born to their pupils.
Every year, 1 million American teenagers become pregnant. It's not uncommon for a large high school to have dozens of girls who suddenly face the shock of moving straight from childhood to motherhood.
Across the black community as a whole, 3/4 of all babies are now born to single mothers. In the poorest neighborhoods, the proportion is higher still.
I lived in a housing project, and we were the only kids in the neighborhood who did not have a mother and father in the house. This is like during the 1940s and 1950s. And today, if you go to the Richard Allen Housing Project where I grew up, it would be exactly the opposite. It would be rare to find a 2-parent family.
A kid born during slavery was more likely to be raised under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today.
It's hard enough to bring up a child when there are 2 parents, but when there's only one, a young girl on her own with little money, it can be lonely and desperate, with many of the joys of motherhood emptied out.
These young girls that end up being single mothers, they're stuck with the baby, and now the child looks like a burden to them more than a blessing.
To accommodate the exploding number of single mothers and children, large municipal housing blocks were built. The children in these neighborhoods were far more likely from an early age to be left unsupervised on the streets. And it is life in the so-called hood that will shape how they think and behave.
You have a jungle where it is survival of the fittest. And in that particular jungle, you have to be tough.
Parents aren't around to monitor what's going on. So if they look a little wimpy, or maybe he seems a little bit more like a dog, his glasses are a little thicker than everybody else's, the kids are gonna jump him.
You have a bunch of young men who are without direction, who have pent up anger and frustration. You will be tested at some point.
They sit slouching, chilling. You know, I'm a gangster.
The walk, the way they look, the swagger.
This is how you be a man. This is how you get respect. You walk around like this, and if a dude look at you the wrong way, you punch him in the face. And so these men are trained, these young boys are trained as a kid to do this.
The skills needed to survive the streets are ill-suited to the classroom.
These same young guys I would see in high school, when it was time to do their work and engage in classwork, they still were holding on to that demeanor of, I'm a gangster, I'm tough. So gangsters don't do homework. Gangsters don't read books. Gangsters don't care about what the teacher's saying. They just they're twisting their dreads while the teacher's talking, could care less what the teacher's saying, not listening to anything.
The children of single mothers tend to do far worse at school. They do not have hard-working parents instilling ambition and setting them an example. Their mothers are too often distracted to take an eager interest in their schooling, too tired to go over homework, too unknowledgeable to help.
Having a father specifically present improves grades, improves health, decreases a female teenager's chances of getting pregnant, decreases a young man's risk of going to prison, and so on. And this is becoming a growing problem in the white community, especially the poor white community. Two-parent black families are substantially less likely to be poor than single-parent white families. That is something that's simply unchallenged in the data, because two people are better than one. It helps to have parents. That is perhaps the greatest privilege, quote unquote, you can have.
As if these disadvantages weren't enough, single parents on welfare have no choice but to send their children to government-run schools, where the standard of discipline and teaching is often deplorably low.
In the city of Baltimore, there are 13 high schools where not a single, predominantly black high schools, where not a single student tests proficient in mathematics, and roughly 13% test proficient in reading. The average black kid who has a high school diploma in his hand can read and write as well as the average white 6th or 7th grader.
Ill-educated, unfamiliar with the demands of work, and with a general demeanor of defensiveness and aggressiveness, growing up on the hood leaves young adults struggling to find and hold down a job.
This demeanor, this image, they were raised to have it as a kid. And so now once they go out into the real world, they still think this is appropriate, this is the way to be. If I bring this being black, I'm black, yo, I'm tough, that attitude alone is intimidating. And any person in their right mind is gonna think, I don't know if I wanna hire him, he might rob me. So.
These are the hardcore unemployed, the high school dropouts who have seldom or never worked.
Employers tell me all they want is somebody who can read, write, and compute at grade level, who'll show up, who'll be polite, who knows how to respect authority. And because of the breakdown of the family, because of the welfare state, because of the change of the norms, many people simply cannot read, write, compute at grade level, have an attitude. They don't know how to behave and interact with people. They don't know how to deal with a boss in a respectful fashion. And as a result, they're much more likely to be unemployed.
If you can't get out of bed in the morning, if you won't look people in the eye, if what you say is hard for people to understand, if you're habitually discourteous, unwilling to please, slovenly and resentful, if you can barely read or write, if you dress and comport yourself like a street thug, then even when there are plenty of jobs available, it is unlikely that you will get one.
Their culture and how they're raised disqualifies them for mainstream American life. Whether it's work, a normal relationship with a healthy young woman, a lot of what they do disqualifies them.
The sad part is this: there is hope and there's a sense of pride when you work for what you have. You value it more, and that's being choked from the black community.
Without a steady income, young men are incapable and have no expectation of supporting a family. Government welfare in these communities has replaced the traditional role of the male breadwinner.
Now, if we take care of you, we your husband, we your daddy. You can't have no other men in here, and you can't run the show. But every month, we'll make sure you get that check, and your rent will be paid.
And so it is normal and expected in welfare-dependent communities for men to make children they won't pay for, with women they won't live with or support.
It's not abnormal for you to be birthed out of wedlock. It's not abnormal for a man to have multiple women. A man not taking care of his responsibilities is not as demonized or frowned upon culturally anymore.
Hip-hop is not rapping about going to school, getting a master's degree, being successful, raising your dad. They're talking about twerking and slapping hoes. So these guys are raised thinking, yeah, we're gonna be watching twerk, slap a hoe. They're not thinking about getting an education and being a man. That's the last thing on their mind.
Sacramento from Harrison.
We're in a pursuit of one of the young men that just ran.
For young men in particular, without a job or the prospect of a spouse or family, without direction, responsibility, or hope, crime fills the void. You don't have to talk properly and be polite to be a drug dealer. In fact, it's a drawback.
You're under arrest.
If you don't understand the concept of getting a proper job or don't even know how to get a proper job, you're going to try to find a way to make money. And in these neighborhoods, a lot of times, it's selling drugs.
Drugs and money is what it's really about.
Most of the drug dealers and gang thugs have little education, don't have a job, and have a tough time making money the honest way.
If you are raised in an environment where drug dealing is normalized or where drug dealing is profitable, then of course you're going to sell drugs.
It's quick money, you don't have to work as hard, and you get a lot of it.
There are no legally enforceable contracts between drug dealers. Their deals are backed by violence and the threat of violence. In this world, violence and murder have become a necessary part of everyday life.
2 young men gunned down at a Chicago strip mall. The first 2 victims of a bloody and violent weekend. One that saw 9 people shot to death and at least 60 others wounded.
Success is how skilled you are at taking from others. Success is dependent upon how tough you are.
As a result of the social and criminal chaos in America's welfare ghettos, murder rates have soared.
You hear the gunfire, and we're in a community where kids know to duck and hide.
This city is called the poorest in the country, and it has a murder rate to match. Just 12 years old and shot to death on the mean streets of Camden, New Jersey.
My son is going and he's not coming back.
Oh, the murder rate is so high. No wonder the cops are afraid when they stop a car in one of these black communities that the kid on the inside has a gun and is going to kill him. No wonder the cops are so quick in their own defense sometimes to pull their gun in to shoot.
Stay in the car! Stay in the car!
They have to actually deal with violent people.
Black people growing up in the first half of the 20th century faced great material challenges and terrible open racism. But they worked and saved and married. Men called their spouses wives, not bitches and whores. They aspired to bring up children secure in their love, who would get on in life and do better than their parents. But in the welfare ghettos of today, such stable relationships are vanishingly rare. The devastating consequence of welfare has been to deprive women of husbands and deny men the responsibility and joy of a lifelong partner and family. No wonder young men in welfare ghettos seem not to fear incarceration or even death. Life itself counts for little when it is so lacking in purpose and love.
It's non-stop. I heard gunshots this morning. I don't feel safe at all.
Going to jail back and forth, killing, and also watching brothers get killed. It can take a toll on your life. It can take a toll on your mind.
For veteran civil rights campaigner Bob Woodson, this whole social catastrophe is the inevitable, tragic consequence of the welfare revolution.
Welfare is a dagger in the soul of Black America. It's been devastating.
The irony is that the massive expansion of the welfare state was meant to lift people out of poverty. And yet, across the world, wherever big welfare systems have been introduced, the results are the same. A breakdown of the family, the descent of neighborhoods into dispirited criminal ghettos, and a whole class of people trapped in poverty.
There are other people who sincerely believe that if they will hand out things here and there, that this will in fact benefit people. Again, looking at
your point is it doesn't.
It doesn't. I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty.
We have spent $22 trillion in 50 years on programs to aid the poor. That's more money than it takes to buy all of the agricultural land in the country, more money than we've spent collectively on all of our wars. And yet, the needle has barely moved on reducing poverty.
We spent $20 trillion, T as in Tyrannosaurus, over the last 50 years on the war on poverty, and poverty has won. So it seems to me that if you're an intelligent, bright person, you would look at yourself in the mirror and say, I need to rethink my assumptions, but they can't.
Although welfare failed to lift people out of poverty, it did what LBJ predicted. Large numbers of black people came to depend not on themselves, their families, or their communities, but on the government. And to keep the welfare taps turned on, they voted Democrat.
Lyndon B. Johnson was very smart. He said it, it came to pass. Homie, dead and gone. But what he said came to pass.
The reality is that has come to full fruition. And for the most part, since 1964, blacks have voted anywhere between 80% all the way to 95% Democrat.
Whether that uniqueness was there.
For the Democrats, welfare dependency was not a problem. On the contrary, it was the very thing that secured them votes.
People vote for you when they think that they can depend on you, when they are dependent on you. To the extent that people become self-reliant and can feel they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, to that extent do you lose your hold on their votes. One of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
The welfare revolution won votes for the Democrats, and not just in the welfare ghettos. The massive expansion of the welfare state created a vast number of new jobs in government administration, greatly expanding America's public sector.
This is the nerve center for paying cash benefits to America's growing family of 23 million Social Security beneficiaries.
The Great Society programs eventually became the middle-class Great Society bureaucracy.
America once prided itself on a small, efficient public administration. But in the decade following LBJ's welfare reforms, several million new government jobs were created. The millions who owed their jobs to the expansion of the welfare state were naturally reluctant to blame welfare for the chaos of America's urban ghettos. In fact, to them, every social problem merely served to justify an even larger welfare state.
We need more funding for this. We need more funding for that. We need to implement another program for this. We need to implement another program for that.
As one government program failed, another one or two would soon replace it, each time increasing still further the government bureaucracy. By 2019 in America, there were twice as many people employed in government as there were working in manufacturing.
Anyone who works for or is for big government is never going to oppose big government. They're going to always push for the government to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
For the supporters of big government, it was vital to deny and divert attention from the poisonous effects of welfare. The crisis in America's welfare ghettos had to be blamed on something else.
If you work for the welfare state, if you believe in the so-called war on poverty, it is awfully difficult for you to then look at the data and say, oh my goodness, what have I done? I have dismantled the nuclear intact family in this country. They can't do that.
However, those people in government have a vested interest in not blaming the programs that they're working for. You can't blame the poverty on what you've done. You have to blame it on something else. You have to blame it on racism.
Racism, for Democrats, provided the scapegoat to explain away the misery of the ghettos.
Racism is the reason why a father's not in the family. Racism is the reason why black-on-black crime is happening in their own communities. Racism is the reason why kids are undereducated because of their schools. Racism is the reason why Jenny got 5 kids by 4 different men.
To many Democrats, the collapse of the black family was not caused by welfare, but was somehow the legacy of slavery. When young blacks from welfare ghettos were sent to jail, it was the fault of racist cops and judges. When poor young blacks struggled to get a job or to get into university, it was blamed not on lousy government schools that failed to teach them how to read and write, but on the racial bigotry of college administrators and employers. To civil rights campaigner Bob Woodson, to blame racism for all these problems is a flagrant act of political cynicism.
The majority of the cities where you find the greatest failures of low-income blacks are cities that have been run by their own people. Blacks dominate city council, the police department, the courts, the education system in places like Chicago, Washington, Trenton, Newark, Baltimore. The majority of the teachers are black. The majority of the school boards are black. So the question is, if blacks are running the systems where other blacks are failing, how can that be associated with racism?
It's hard to see how historic racism could have caused the explosion since the 1960s of black single-parent families.
If you look at fatherlessness in black communities, that is not a legacy of slavery. The black community had gotten the out-of-wedlock birth rate down to about 10% in 1938, according to Walter Williams. That's now 75%, 74.3%, okay? That has absolutely nothing to do with historical racism.
Likewise, if racism were to blame for there being so many black people in prison, why was the black prison population so much lower in the first half of the 20th century, when racism was far, far worse?
Black people take up 12% of the population, but 50% of the crime. But that's because of racism. It has nothing to do with the fact that they're actually breaking laws.
Mass incarceration is to a large extent a result of mass crime. If you look at U.S. crime rates between 1963 and 1993, crime increased about 560%. Not just among blacks, but among Puerto Ricans, Italian Americans, many other groups, Southern whites, and all those groups went to prison nearly proportionately. It is wildly unlikely that the recent surge in crime is due to racism, because obviously racism has not dramatically increased.
What's more, if racism is to blame for the plight of poor black people, how is it that black immigrants from poor countries do so well in America?
I think the immigrants to our country that, who come from countries without a welfare state, they have not developed the welfare mentality. They get up and work and are successful.
When Somali refugees first arrived in Lewiston, many found employment or started businesses.
Many black and Asian immigrants to the U.S. come from countries where there is little or no welfare. Family stability and the work ethic are still strong. As a result, black immigrants to America are often more successful even than white Americans.
Black Caribbeans that have migrated to the United States and become American citizens, they have a median income that's slightly higher than Americans in general.
First-generation blacks of Caribbean and African ancestry, they tend to do extremely well in this country. At every single income level, at every single wealth level, they tend to do extremely well, not merely as compared to their black counterparts, but compared to virtually every other American group.
One of the most successful groups in the USA happens to be black immigrants. If you look at Nigerian Americans, and Ghanaians do just as well, West Indians do just as well, I'm just picking the largest group here. Nigerian Americans are the best educated group in the country, and with a household income of about $67,000 a year, they slightly out-earn whites. They would dramatically out-earn whites, except that so many of them become fairly poorly paid teachers and college professors, given all those degrees.
Though the problems of the ghetto are often blamed on racism, it is not always easy to identify specific acts of bigotry or actual racists. Instead, accusations of racism are often based on statistics. If there are proportionately more black people in prison, it must be racism. If there are fewer black people in Ivy League universities or in jobs like accountancy, it must be down to racism. They call this systemic racism.
We got to tackle systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
Systemic racism in our country.
For the Democrats, fighting this systemic racism naturally called for yet more government intervention. Jobs were created, inequality and inclusion. and not just in government. To handle affirmative action, anti-discrimination, and race employment laws, large companies and organizations had to hire dedicated staff. Consultancy sprang up. Law firms began to specialize. A diversity industry was created.
Diversity is now what we refer to as a C-level in the business world, i.e. it's a CEO or CFO level title, CDO, Chief Diversity Officer. It's hard to imagine a Fortune 500 corporation that doesn't have a CDO. And I think that anyone that didn't at this moment would be a little bit nervous.
The rise of the diversity industry saw the creation of a large number of professionals and organizations whose jobs and funding depended on there being racism.
If you're in the African American Studies Department at a university, it is in their best interest to constantly find racism. You have a whole bunch of people, pundits on cable TV, professors in college, people that belong to organizations like the NAACP. It is in their best interest to see the world through what I call race-tinted glasses, and that's what they do.
The race grievance industry would have you believe that blacks get up and think about nothing else except race.
Those who make their living in the diversity industry are understandably reluctant to acknowledge any decline in racism.
From any commonsensical perspective, if you have a large group of upper middle class people whose salaries depend on identifying and fighting a great deal of racism, and these salaries can reach into the six figures, they're unlikely to report that there's almost no racism.
There is a whole big cottage industry for racism. If racism went away, a lot of people would be unemployed.
I think that racism is being constantly resurrected, resuscitated by people who benefit from accusations of racial discrimination.
It was the job of the diversity industry to find racism, and so they found it, in places no one before had thought of looking.
As traditional racism almost fades away, you've seen the redefinition of racism to mean something very different from what we've always thought of it as being.
Among the new forms of racism is cultural appropriation. If a German pope visits Mexico, it is deemed to be racist for him to wear a sombrero, no matter how much it seems to delight the crowd. In a bizarre echo of segregation, it is now forbidden to copy or adopt the styles of a different culture.
If cultural appropriation were a valid idea, I couldn't wear pants and shoes. Most of the civilized African peoples preferred robes and sandals.
I play piano. Is that a European instrument? Did I culturally appropriate that? Is Wynton Marsalis a cultural appropriator because he plays the trumpet, a European instrument?
If as a Caucasian, you can't, for example, in good conscience, make Mexican or Asian food or dance to hip-hop beats or learn certain aspects of a foreign language, it is a legitimate question. It becomes a legitimate question. What advantage does diversity provide? Aren't I now just surrounded by strangers that often seem angry at me?
To some, the left is guilty of a trivialization of racism. There are still racists in America and countless acts of real racial bigotry. But to constantly find racism where there is none, to denounce people as racist who are not, to frivolously and casually use racism as a cheap political slur, does nothing to expose, but can rather conceal genuine bigotry.
All that does is cause people to become more cynical when people argue that there is serious racism. And of course there's racism in America. This is a country with 300 million people. 8% of Americans believe Elvis is still alive. I don't know what to tell you. There's some idiots in this country.
But there was another reason why race and racism became so important to the Democrats. The Democrats had long posed as the party of the working man. But LBJ's welfare revolution proved to be deeply unpopular among America's wider tax-paying working class. In the election that followed his reforms, support for the Democrats from America's white working class collapsed spectacularly to just 35%. Working class people, it seemed, were closer to the world of welfare and better understood what it did. Their views on welfare were articulated by a rising star in the Republican Party, the former actor Ronald Reagan.
The working men and women of this nation voted against taxing themselves to provide a standard of living for others that was often more than they could afford for their own families. They voted against the idea that government must always grow larger and more costly and powerful.
Ordinary working class Americans that are not recipients of government largesse do not believe that their salvation comes with paying higher taxes for bigger government that can regulate their lives even more.
We've a responsibility for lending a helping hand to those who, through no fault of their own, couldn't find work. We should help them to help themselves. And that's all that most people want, is a helping hand when they need it until they can get back on their feet. Man is a creature of the spirit, and filling his belly doesn't make up for emptying his soul of self-reliance. The welfare burden is 10 times as big as it was in the dark days of the Depression, institutionalizing poverty for millions of our people. Welfare, as we know it in America, is a colossal and almost complete failure, a hopeless end to the road.
Ronald Reagan was swept to power on a tide of working-class support. Of those who voted for him for president, 70% had no college degree.
Working class Americans, they have become more and more Republican in their voting patterns and their ideology.
If you know someone's race and income, you very, very likely know who they're voting for. 88% of African Americans vote for the Democrats. 70% of working class white Christians, if not more, vote for the Republicans.
At one time, the Democrat Party was seen as the party of the working man, and the Republican Party was seen as the party of the country club, but that has been reversed.
Democrats are confused and dismayed that working-class Americans do not crave higher taxes and more regulation. How can they explain this working-class rejection of socialism? Racism once again comes to the rescue. Working-class people must be voting Republican because they are ignorant bigots.
I believe it was Barack Obama who said, "Those bitter folk up there in the hills clinging to their guns and their Bibles to dismiss a substantial chunk of the country, to dismiss most of my friends' parents in Kentucky." Hillary Clinton said that I believe 47% of Donald Trump supporters fell into what she called the basket of deplorables, you know, untouchable racists, bigots, and the term simmering under the surface when you hear these comments is white trash.
It is a remarkable historical fact, too often overlooked, that most white Americans vote Republican. And not just in the last election. In every single US presidential election since the 1960s, the Republicans won the votes of the majority of white Americans.
Sir, are you registered to vote?
For more than half a century, the Democrats would have failed to put a single president in the White House without the black vote.
I'm not gonna let you down.
Okay.
If the Democrats ever stopped consistently winning at least 65% of the black vote, they would cease to win elections.
The African American community in South Carolina can make a judgment about who the next president of the United States is going to be.
The Democrat Party not only depend on getting a majority of African American votes, they are absolutely dependent on getting a super majority, a near monopoly of the black vote.
The vote is in your hands, not a joke. You can control this outcome.
If a Republican Party can get 20% of the black vote, then the Democratic Party does not only lose an election, but it becomes an existential crisis.
If more than a third of black people stopped voting for the Democrats wouldn't win any elections. And politicians and academics are very aware of this on the left. And it is, in my opinion, one of the reasons, probably the primary reason, for the constant, consistent focus on race.
For the Democratic Party, highlighting race as one of the main political issues in America is not just useful, it has become essential to its survival.
Race still plays a significant role in determining who gets ahead in America and who gets left behind.
Democrats have come to rely heavily on the specter of racial prejudice to drive black voters to the polls.
The primary basis of the USA Democratic Party's appeal to black voters is the invocation of racism.
Racism.
Racism in this country.
oh, because you're black, if I tell you this is racist, if I tell you that is racist, then, oh, yeah, I'm gonna get you emotional, I'm gonna get you to jump, I'm gonna get you to skip.
One should not be subjected to the indignity of being told to get on your knees and put your hands behind your head simply because you are walking while black.
You're seeing 90% black voting patterns for the Democrats because of they gonna put you back in chains. One of our political parties has managed to convince a great percentage of the African American population that the other party is run by the Klan, which historically has been the opposite of the truth, by the way.
It would be a disaster for the Democrats if black Americans woke up one morning and decided they weren't black after all, just Americans. To keep black people voting as a bloc, they must be encouraged to continue to see themselves as a distinct racial group, at odds with the rest of America.
Progressives, socialists, Democrats have a direct investment in making minorities believe that racism is pervasive, that blacks and Hispanics have no opportunity to advance in society because of racism, that a colorblind society does not exist and can never exist.
It's impossible to envision a world without race. For the Democratic Party, for such people, it's impossible to envision a world that gets beyond race because their bread and butter and their bottom line, their raison d'etre and everything that they're trying to do depends upon people being kept in these boxes.
That the spectre of racism is so useful and necessary for the Democrats perhaps explains why, on the left, it has become routine to accuse people of being racist indiscriminately and casually.
It's just gonna always be they're racist, 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 racist. Everything's racist.
Allegations of racism have reached almost hysterical levels in American universities.
The modern campus is one of the most tolerant, woke environments ever designed by human beings. And yet, accusations of racism are almost constant.
For the Democrat left, the accusation of racism has become a political weapon, used to attack almost anything with which it disagrees.
Today, the term racism is used to describe any incident involving any element of bias or potential bias that irritates someone on the left.
The left's self-proclaimed crusade against racism has instilled in its supporters a furious self-righteousness. It is used to justify a witch hunt of their opponents, who are attacked on the streets, barred from speaking, cancelled from social media, and hounded from their positions. The denunciation of racist is now an instrument of terror for the left, used to dismiss and discredit anyone who dares to disagree with them.
The term racist is very often applied to normal, mainstream, tax-paying citizens who are just a bit less woke than the median on a college campus, which it's not especially difficult to be.
Black people, meanwhile, have been warned to look for racism everywhere, in every look and gesture, in every encounter with their workmates and fellow Americans, to be wary of indirect, unconscious, and implied racism. They are told that all white people are racist, even though they might not act that way or imagine themselves to be. But for ordinary people in their daily lives, to be suspected or accused of being racist is upsetting and frightening. It can alienate friends and lose you your job. All of this creates barriers between people of paranoia and apprehension.
This idea that there are bigots everywhere and they're waiting for you complicates normal interactions between black and white people to a pretty remarkable degree.
It becomes more difficult to strike up a relationship, a genuine, deep relationship with people who are of different racial groups. I can't be totally honest with you because I worry that if I say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, perhaps with the wrong inflection, that this might be interpreted as something hostile.
People are walking on eggshells because of all of this nonsense about cultural appropriation, about microaggression, about the assumption that racism remains a major problem in America.
America's long struggle with race is far from finished.
Every single opportunity that you have to interact with people socially, you find reasons to confirm this ready-made narrative that you have in your head that you are going to be discriminated against.
But according to their critics, The Democrat left's cynical, relentless focus on race and racism is not just divisive. For black people, it is also profoundly damaging and demoralizing.
If you're coaching a team and you say to your players, they're bigger than we are, they've beat us 3 times before, they outweigh us, so get out there and do your best and try not to get killed. How motivated would you be to get out on that team and compete?
The worst thing you could say to a young black child is that there is racism pervasive everywhere, under every carpet, under every table, around every corner. So that kid goes around in life believing they've got no opportunity to succeed.
You're black, so they already think this about you. They already think that about you. So these kids come into this world thinking, they don't like me because I'm black. They don't. So you basically, if every single card is dealt against you, and you don't know a way out, you don't care.
Why try to do better when you imagine that no matter what you do, there are forces out there, malevolent forces that are working against you?
Economic barriers, health barriers, education barriers.
That takes a pretty serious toll, I think, on anyone's self-confidence.
Telling people and convincing them they are a victim paralyzes them and prevents them from ever doing anything to elevate themselves.
Simply being told that your society is racist day in and day out leads to depression, leads to underperformance, and perhaps most dramatically, it leads to hatred of your society.
But perhaps the greatest damage done by the left's obsessive focus on race is that it has diverted attention from the real cause of the social crisis in America's poorest black neighborhoods, leaving these communities in a perpetual state of despair. Deeply shocking, too, to Professor Glenn Loury, is the way the left used the excuse of racism to disguise the abject failure of government schools to provide even the most basic level of education to many black children.
It's a moral catastrophe as well, if I may just say. It's not just a policy failure. There's a moral problem here that these high-minded people who sit up on high and say that they're doing the right thing by rooting out discrimination, when in fact they're looking the other way while the human development of African American children is not being advanced, are actually ethically wrong. They're not just wrong about the policy. They're on the wrong side of history. They're on the wrong side of doing what's right for our people.
But today's left-wing anti-racism movement has a problem. Its promotion of transgender politics, its distaste for consumer society, its obsession with climate change plays well with university students, but less well with many ordinary black Americans.
It's important, especially for white people, to show up and to fight against fascism.
At anti-capitalist, anti-racism protests, it is striking how few black people there are. In the so-called race riot in Minneapolis, 85% of the protesters were white. In the supposed race riot in Los Angeles, only 3% of those taking part were black.
One of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen was the mob during the Minneapolis riots following the death of George Floyd. That must have been 75 to 80% white. A bunch of white thugs, frankly, burning down the city's traditional black and Asian business district, Lake Street, while chanting Black Lives Matter. It was literally surreal.
Me and my sisters and my brother and my mom have been out in our business for the past 4 nights asking people, this is black-owned business. Please don't destroy this. This is a minority business. Please don't do this to us.
What's your name, ma'am?
Bevelyn.
Bevelyn, Beatty and her friends have decided to confront some of BLM's white supporters.
Black Lives Matter and the things that you guys are doing, terrorizing and shutting down a business, is not in representation of black people. When this cause is over and black people still gotta walk these streets and live in this neighborhood with that hovering over their head, that gray cloud, that in the name of Black Lives Matter, people's neighborhoods was terrorized, we look bad.
Do you inherently find the phrase
Black Lives Matter offensive or bothersome?
Let me tell you something. I got a gun wound in my leg. I got cuts in my back. I got a felony, been in jail, okay? I got cousins who was locked up 26 years. You want to talk about black life? I'm really from the hood. Really from the hood. So let me make something very clear. Let me make something very clear. And a lot of the things I felt and dealt with oppression came from my own people. Now, I'm not saying that police are innocent, but at the end of the day, our own people are terrorizing us too. On top of that, the #1 killer of African Americans, they don't want to hear it. This is the problem. They don't want to hear the truth because they're ignorant. They want to be stuck in that same box.
To Bevelyn, randomly smashing up businesses clearly has nothing to do with fighting racism. She believes the feverish anti-racism of Black Lives Matter is nothing but a cynical ploy to make the otherwise unpopular anti-capitalist politics of the left seem more noble and virtuous.
Mister, stop pushing me away from me.
I'm not.
Stop. I'm standing because these punks have been terrorizing everybody in the name of black people. They're punks. They're punks. None of y'all in the ghetto. None of y'all in the hood. Oh. But we black. You gonna tell me how to be black, right? You're a fraud. Look at you. These are frauds. These are people that are Democrats. Democrats ain't nothing but Dixiecrats. Let me tell you something. A Democrat been a racist from the beginning. All they did was hire a new face of a new form of KKK to come and oppress people to make them vote Democrat when the reality is they're racist. They ain't nothing but Dixiecrats in a new outfit. Dixiecrats. Y'all ain't nothing. Y'all the same Democrat Party who been terrorizing black people from the beginning. And now y'all got the audacity to say Black Lives Matter. Y'all don't care about black people.
Many people who genuinely hate the idea of racism feel they must pay lip service to Black Lives Matter. Many individuals and organizations feel intimidated into supporting BLM for fear of being denounced. But according to Bevelyn Beatty, taking the knee and bowing to the cause of Black Lives Matter represents nothing more than a craven submission to the politics and authority of the American left, which is perhaps why more people are now refusing to do it.
Why do it? Why take the knee? Who are you bowing to? Oh, I bow. I'm not racist. And it's just, for you to do it, you're basically telling these Democrats you submit to their agenda and you bow to their agenda. That's what you do when you bow. You're bowing to these Democrats. I will never bow, and I'll encourage anybody else, don't bow.
In the run-up to the last presidential election, the fury of BLM's white activists reached new heights, violently denouncing all supporters of Donald Trump as racist bigots. But could this hysteria reflect a nervous suspicion on the left that their grip on Black America is waning?
At this lunch table in Charlotte, North Carolina, there's unabashed support for President Donald Trump.
So he's delivered on quite a few of the promises that he's made, but nobody wants to admit that.
In the 2020 election, there was a notable swing from Democrat to Republican among Black, Hispanic, and Asian American voters.
I love this guy right here. Yeah.
That dream has to be kept alive for each and every one of you as well.
When it comes to education, too, the Black community appears to be rebelling against the left. For decades, Democrats have defended shockingly bad government schools. But Black parents are waking up to what's happening. Instead of wasting their taxes and throwing away their children's futures in these failed schools, they're demanding vouchers to send their children to far better, privately run charter schools.
Teachers union, public employees don't want the competition from these private charter schools, and therefore Black Lives Matter doesn't like charter schools, and therefore the NAACP doesn't like charter schools. But guess what? Black parents like charter schools.
We're trying to protest to get more charter schools going, which I think is a whole lot better than the public schools. They challenge the kids more.
If you look at polls in the inner city, Black parents and brown parents overwhelmingly want the ability to take their kid out of an underperforming government school and put their kid into a better school. Yet the Democratic Party, that supposedly is pro-Black and pro-brown, is opposed to that.
Charter school supporters say the all-choice system is working. The city has gone from having 78 failing schools to only 9.
In New York City, where they have a voucher program, 4 times as many parents are trying to get in it as are seats available. That's how popular it is.
What matters today is, I want other school to
to give opportunity to parents and other children who want to have a good education. That's why I'm here today.
These are parents who are saying, we want education for our children. Nothing could be more important, it seems to me, in terms of dealing with racial inequality in the United States.
In other ways, too, it seems the radical left are simply out of touch with the values of ordinary black people.
Blacks are very religious as a population within the American context. A lot of black people are against abortion. Try to find an African-American public figure who speaks for life and not for abortion. I'm not taking a position here myself personally about the issue. I'm just saying, they go to storefront churches and beat tambourines. They roll around on the floor in the Holy Ghost when it's possessing them. They preach these fiery sermons and they sing these beautiful hymns. These are African-American religious people. They read their Bible and they believe it. They pray. I'm talking about real people. I see nothing representing their cultural and value orientation in the expressions in the public arena of African-American politicians. It's a scandal.
The specter of racism serves many purposes for the Democrat left. It diverts attention from the social chaos caused by welfare and the failure of government schools. It is used to intimidate and silence their opponents, to demonize ordinary Americans who vote against them, and to justify more government interference in our lives. And it is used to frighten and cajole black Americans into voting Democrat, without which the Democrats would struggle ever to achieve power. But critics of the Democrat left believe that history is against them, that the game they are playing of racial division and mistrust is doomed to fail.
Obama said that racism is in America's DNA. Racism is in America's DNA. In the 1950s, if you ask a white person, would you ever vote for a black person for president, no matter how well qualified, the numbers saying yes were in the single digits. Obama could not become president if, in fact, racism were in America's DNA.
The United States is quite possibly the least racist, along with the UK, white majority country in the modern world. And racism, by any real definition of that term, has been in substantial decline for quite some time.
Among regular Americans, we are probably more integrated and have a desire to be integrated more now than ever in our history.
Despite all this hue and cry about racism and institutional racism and structural racism and systemic racism, people are getting along quite well in America. The best way an anthropologist will tell you to determine whether or not people are getting together, getting along, is interracial marriage. And interracial marriage in America is booming.
Trump landslide wasn't.
Today, 1 in 5 marriages in America is between people considered to be from different racial backgrounds.
The black-white intermarriage rates are up. Now I think something like 15% of black men who are married to a white woman.
Usually you just like stick the knife in it.
Is it old?
Ex-cop Brandon Tatum and his wife Corrine are among the millions for whom race didn't matter.
So we met on Instagram. She saw me on Fox News and said, "This is the most handsome man I've ever seen in my life. He's a great catch, and let me follow him on social media."
Oh, he wishes that's not how it went.
And I thought she was a troll. Because this incredibly beautiful woman, maybe this is a fake account, somebody stole it and they just posting pictures of a random woman and they're stalking me. But it was like an epiphany. It was like, This is your wife.
Yeah.
And the logistics part of it is the only reason it took so long for us to get married, because I had to save up for a wedding ring and all that other stuff. So other than that, we could have been married right away.
Yeah. I hate that people are so obsessed with race that character, interests, commonalities don't matter, and that skin color comes first. Where to me, they're the ones screaming anti-racist, but their whole message is racist.
If you are black, you are white, none of that matters. We're all Americans. Let's listen to what Martin Luther King said. Let's judge people based on character and not the color of their skin. We are all united in the United States of America. We are all partners in this. We are a melting pot of assimilation that have made us the greatest country on planet Earth.
I want to say to my fellow African Americans here in the 21st century, we're already home. This is where we're going to take our stand and make our lives. Here. We couldn't possibly be in a better place. I want to say, notwithstanding, I'm not a Pollyanna. It's not like I'm unaware that there are racial problems and issues and frustrations that are going on out there. But really, if we adopt this stance of withdrawal and turning our back on our own country, of contempt for its values, of a sense of permanent alienation, we'll be handicapping ourselves. It's gratuitous. It's unnecessary. Stop it.
In the fluid, mobile 21st century, in the age of the internet, individuals are less and less forced to identify with a particular culture or group just because of the accident of their birth or the color of their skin.
All of the various technologies we have at our disposal now are empowering individuals to find communities that are perhaps very specific to them personally, that they have these unique interests and they can find people that share those interests. And those people, unsurprisingly in many cases, don't happen to look like them.
Finally, people are beginning to challenge the very division of Americans into black and white. These are ugly, racist labels that date back to the days of slavery. Their use in everyday life seems increasingly outdated, irrelevant, and offensive. The time surely has come to move on.
I don't find it satisfying to think of myself as a black person. I'm an individual. I'm Camille, I'm a father and a husband and a bunch of other remarkable things. And all of those things are far more important to me than being black.
When people talk about black culture, I have no idea what they're talking about. I don't even know what that means. Tiger Woods was the top golfer in this country for a while. He's a person of color. I thought golf was a white sport. Eminem, for a while, was the top rapper in the country. I thought rapper was a black art form. I mean, this is America. You can be what you want to be. You can embrace what you want to embrace. You can pursue what you want to pursue. So the idea that there's a black culture, I don't even know what that means. I'm an American.
I am not African. I am 100% American. My culture is American. There is nothing African about me. I'm American, period.